Tim Koch has been working on his third decade for his employer. He originally thought he'd be an accountant. He's not, but he is still all about the numbers. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Tim is the Executive Vice President for Business Development for Farm Credit Services of America. He's had all kinds of roles with the company over the years as he has ascended, but it's this current role. That's why we get to talk to Tim. He will walk us through the Farm Credit Services of America's new land report. It looks at 8 states in the greater Midwestern region of the United States, and this will cover the first 6 months of 2025. We will not only talk about the numbers and why the numbers are what they are, but also what Tim sees for the second half of 2025. We start our conversation with what got Tim here. All right, so you're an accounting, banking, finance guy, right? How does that happen and why?
Well, when I went to school, accounting and numbers was kind of what I thought I wanted to do.
Okay.
I started prepping for the CPA exam when I was a senior, and then I quickly realized that was not what I wanted to do. When I came out of school, the job market wasn't great, and so I had an opportunity to be a bank examiner.
Okay.
And quite honestly, I didn't have a lot of different opportunities to choose from. So that was my first role, was as a bank examiner. And what a great opportunity to learn the finance industry. You're going in different banks, every week, and focus on training was really, really good. But traveling and being on the road all the time wasn't ideal either. And so looked at some different things and ultimately ended up in the farm credit system. I grew up in a rural community, so, being closer to agriculture, and a lot of the banks that, we were in were ag-focused banks. And so it's been a very humbling and fabulous industry to be part of, the food chain, and what a great group of people to get to work with every day. So agriculture's kind of been where I've been at, and it's allowed me to do what I enjoy doing. So
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in southeast Nebraska, a little town of DeWitt.
Okay. It seems like most anybody you talk to has some kind of connection as a kid, either directly on the farm or in the vicinity.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in town. My father had a construction company, but my grandparents had a really small dairy. And so I always joked that I had the best of all worlds. I could still go to the swimming pool in town, but had an opportunity to be on the farm as well. As I mentioned, they had a small dairy, so I got the opportunity to milk cows. I'm not sure that was something I wanted to do long term, but it's all about life's lessons, and then it allows you to guide your career choices as well.
Regardless of whether you stuck in it or not, though, man, there's nothing like that's like real work,
It
right?
is very
Which that's
real
a
work.
skill set you will, no matter what the heck you're doing, even if you would have been an accountant, you would have still had that work ethic, though, right?
Certainly. It was glad to have had those opportunities and experiences, no doubt.
Okay, so we really wanted to have you on to talk about this survey that you all did. And so just to set it up, you're talking about primarily 8 states here: Iowa, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Kansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Wyoming. And
Yep.
you do this twice a year, right?
Yeah.
And so now
So
that we're kind of midway through and we're talking to you at the end of July as we swing into August, as you look at some of the top lines, did anything grab you, surprise you, or had you been watching these trends to get us to this point?
Yeah, I think we've been focused on the trends. One of the biggest things as an ag lender we focus on is what's going on in the real estate market. What are the values doing? Because it serves to influence so much of not only our business, but how our farmers and ranchers are performing. And maybe if you'll oblige me, I'll take you back a little bit and help you understand why and how we do this
For
this
sure.
benchmarking study. So if you just look at the landscape, and we can pick a state, we'll pick on Iowa. If you just look at the sales activity as it occurs in the state of Iowa, you can look at all the sales, you can look at the average sales price, and you can come up with a change in what that is. But what we know is the type of ground, the location of the ground, and more specifically, the quality of that ground can really greatly influence the price. You know, the price of ground in Northwest Iowa is greatly different than it is in Southeast Iowa, right? And so if you have a higher propensity or higher volume of sales in Northwest Iowa, you can skew what your reported price trends are. So what we do as an organization is we call them benchmark farms. And so twice a year, we revalue those same, I think it's about 90 farms now that we track. We revalue those same 90 farms. And so quality is always held constant in our model. So when we look at the price trends, there are certainly short-term influences that can impact that, but we're really talking about holding the quality of the ground static. And so we feel like we get a smoother trend in prices, but also a more consistent trend in the price changes that we report, if that makes sense.
For sure. And in Iowa, things have really kind of slowed down. We're not seeing the volume of sales like we had been. Is that consistent in this 8-state region?
It is pretty consistent. We've seen fewer auctions and the number of sales slow down a little bit. As we look at real estate price trends, we consistently refer to there's about three primary drivers of real estate values. The first one you've just, referenced, it's the supply and demand. If you have lower supply and, demand is constant, we'll see those prices escalate. The other impact, and it's interesting, you have to see all of these interact with each other, but interest rates, when taken as a whole, typically has a impact on real estate values because it's for most people that are borrowing money against that, or you've got an alternative return on that investment, you're focused on what's the impact of the interest rate environment. And then the third thing we focus on is really what's the sentiment in agriculture. And that is generally tied to what's the commodity prices, what's the economic environment. But, as we look at those price trends, we think about all three of those things really impacting that. And you touched on one of them. Overall supply of real estate sales, the supply of available real estate on the market is down, year over year. And, we can talk more about it, but the commodity price environment looks bearish, but we haven't seen dramatic decline in real estate values across most of that geography, which I think is being propped up still by that reduced supply of real estate. And at the end of the day, if we think about some of the headlines for what's driving this, the overall financial position in agriculture is still pretty good as we think about it on more of a macro level, not looking through just the front windshield about what commodity prices look like they're going to be in December of this year.
And I think that's one thing that's especially helpful reading through your report is that so much of, really our media culture right now is this kind of avalanche of news and a lot of top line headlines. And without the context of this, it's pretty difficult to understand. Plus, you're also looking at so many different dynamics within the 8 states because some of these states, like, well, I'm in Iowa, you're in Nebraska, we have some things going on that, our friends in maybe South Dakota and Wyoming, they're producing other stuff harder than what we're doing. And so the trends are different here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You've got the overall market dynamics that are consistent across, but, if you look at the report, real estate values when reported at a state level, if you're talking about South Dakota, can be heavily influenced, whether you're talking about crop ground or you're talking about, grassland, pasture, rangeland. The price today of corn and soybeans relative to what cost of production is vastly different than what our cow-calf customers and ranchers are experiencing. So all of those individual dynamics certainly impact that. And when you look at the geographic expanse of our organization, being almost exclusively in the Midwest, but North Dakota to Kansas and Iowa to Wyoming, there's some pretty significant differences that can impact those individual values and trends.
Okay, I'm a middle-aged guy. I've got a 15-year-old son and a 9.5-year-old daughter. I try to occasionally pick up some terms for them so that I can be on the cusp of having the cool words. Cooking is one of it. I presume your son as an athlete probably uses it because you can cook on the mound. They use cook
Sure.
on different things. As you
Yep.
look at these 8 states, is South Dakota cooking the most?
I think it is maybe not in that same term.
Okay.
As I look at, South Dakota is a state where we're seeing um, not as much pullback. We actually saw some of the values increase in South Dakota. I think that's because it wasn't overcooked, maybe to use that term like
Okay.
Iowa has been for the last several years.
Okay.
Maybe a little more moderate growth. They've had some weather challenges. The other thing that we know about some of the states, and South Dakota is one of those, in Iowa, and especially this year, it seems like it just rains every day. Normal
Seriously.
years in Iowa, you get an inch of rain about every week. South Dakota acknowledges that, every so many years there's going to be a drought. They may not
Hmm.
raise a very good crop. So
Hmm.
they don't get too high or too low through what's impacting them, right now. The other thing that I think is continuing to drive some of the values, whether it's in South Dakota, I think North Dakota is experiencing this as well. I mean, we're seeing some changes in weather patterns. And the growing days in South Dakota, if you want to look at this over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, has become more conducive to growing corn and soybeans
Hmm.
than what it was 20 years ago. North Dakota is also starting to see some of that transition from almost exclusively small grains to now, there's more corn, there's more soybeans and more higher value crops that are being grown, which also has an impact on real estate values. At the end of the day, people have to purchase real estate for a price that allows them to make a return and make a living in that. And so I think that's another impact as we think about some of the northern states is expanded growing season and opening up to some higher value crops, if that makes sense.
And if you're looking at the 8 states for the first 6 months of 25, values have ticked up a little bit overall, right? As an average.
Overall, yep. And you've got states like Iowa where we've actually seen a pullback. You've got states like South Dakota. I think South Dakota cropland is up about 3.5%. Now, I think we've got, we talked about the number of sales is down.
Hmm.
So your sample size is a little bit lower. Iowa, I got to look at my notes here. Iowa's off just a basically flat.
Yeah.
Now, the difference between 3% and flat or even 1 or 2% drop, that's still what I would characterize real estate trends in the Midwest are stable to maybe trending lower. To look at anything and say, well, it's up 2%, that's not an absolute number, especially as you have a smaller sample size. So we don't get too focused on is it 1%, 2%, or 3%. It's more what's the general trend. And so I would say we characterize the trend in real estate values across the Midwest as flat to softening across that general region. Now, the thing we have to understand, Dave, is we'll see parcels that for whatever reason they don't sell. There was not a bid, and the willing buyers weren't there that day, and the seller
Hmm.
decided they're not willing to take any price. And then we also have those situations where you have two neighbors that really feel really strongly about that 80-acre tract, and it sells for something that's, not consistent with what the overall trends are. And that can also influence those price values.
What kind of impact are you seeing for beef prices? We've been watching them, even on watching traditional mainstream news. It's the price of beef, the price of your burger, the price of your steak, more from the consumer side. And obviously, herds were down so much, 60-year low, whatever that was. Is that reflecting in some of these land value trends that you're seeing for the states that are more heavily into beef?
Yeah, as we think about Western Nebraska, Wyoming, even Western South Dakota, a lot of that is, ranch land, range, pasture, whatever the term for that is. And profitability, especially in that cow-calf sector, has been really, really strong. And so you would anticipate that producer sentiment is really, really good. They have more available cash to spend, and you would anticipate that you would see those real estate values increasing. And, our numbers in Wyoming would show that year over year up about 5%. I think there's little doubt that the profitability in cow calf and ranching is influencing that, but maybe not to the extent that we would have anticipated.
Hmm.
And, we're still seeing that, by primary indications, we're not seeing a rebuilding of the cow herd, as you would think would happen through this level of profitability. I think there's questions and people wondering, what is the true staying power of the consumer to continue to
Mhm.
buy beef at these levels?
Mhm.
And, you know, ranchers' memory is can be pretty long. And remember that things were pretty thin. So do you want to take the profits you made and buy back hold back heifers instead of selling them for more money
Mhm.
than you ever have,
Mhm.
and then wait 2 or 3 years and hope that you get that right return? So it's an interesting dynamic. As somebody who loves to consume a ribeye, I'd love to see expansion of the cow herd so we could, bring the price of those down. But to date, we're just not. And as long as the consumer's still, willing to spend that amount of money, it doesn't matter if it's, for hamburger or steaks. Um, I guess the other thing I would share, Dave, is my crystal ball has said we were going to see this beef price start to move down about a year ago, and it's
Mhm.
stayed remarkably resilient, which to get us back to where we started this, I think is supportive of, real estate values, especially in grass and pasture land.
I grew up in Southern Illinois, St. Louis overall market, but did not grow up on a farm. Didn't have any close relatives who farmed, but in in the one direction, it was nothing but corn. So we at least got to see it when I went to grade school because it was just right across the road from where my school was. So I'm
Yeah.
always fascinated by corn, truthfully. But one of the things that you pointed out in the report is that there was this thinking among some that the depressed corn prices would just tank some of the farmland values, right? And while maybe Nebraska and Iowa, where we're producing more corn, maybe we're not going gangbusters farmland values, but we're also not collapsing. What has helped hold that up?
I think there's a couple things. We always understand that there are, ebbs and flows in what individual commodity prices are. If you just looked at the forward price of corn, you would anticipate that the price of real estate would fall pretty precipitously because for a lot of producers, now this year, if you've driven up and down the road, we have a high probability that we'll bushel through this year. I mean,
Hmm.
yields are likely going to be really, really strong, which is what's being reflected in the commodity price that we're seeing. But we're a year away from, we could have a significant crop failure Maybe it's in Argentina. That'd be the best place for that to happen
Hmm.
for US producers. Or maybe that's in South Dakota, and that price can move pretty significantly. We're coming off 3 or 4 or 5 years of really good profit margins for a majority of producers. And so there's still some cash reserves in the bank. They were able to pay down some of that debt. And so when we think about the overall financial condition of a majority of US agriculture, it's still pretty good. The ability to absorb what looks like a year of pretty depressed prices is still going to be okay. Nobody buys farmland just for the purpose of farming it in 26. These become some forever purchases. The other dynamic that I think is in play is most of the sales activity we were seeing is into production agriculture or those people that are really closely tied to that. We went through a period of time where we saw investor influence driving prices higher. That investor from Chicago or St. Louis that just wants to own some ag real estate as a pure investment, there's there's other and better yielding investments that they're doing now. So maybe to come back to that question, people that are buying ag real estate today are viewing this as a long-term play, a generational decision they're making. And that's not necessarily solely influenced by what the short-term impact of commodity prices is.
When on your report, you can go back to, you do 6 month, year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year. And it is to your point about the longer term play, just looking at the top four on my list, 10 years for Iowa up almost 45%, Nebraska 29 plus, South Dakota 47, Wyoming 107%. So overall, just for those four states, you're talking about an average of 43.2. I
Yeah.
mean, that is some consistent long-term value.
It is. And, agriculture's been pretty good over the last, if we take that whole 10-year time frame. We went through a dip, COVID, a period that most of us would like to not revisit,
Yeah.
was honestly pretty good for agriculture as well. So,
Hmm.
the US continues to play a very strong role in the global agricultural market. And, you know, well, trade and tariffs is, garnering a lot of the headlines. US agriculture is still very significantly sought after and continues to play a significant role. And I think that's also been what's part of that growing return over that window.
And I want to hit you on that. I'm going to hit the other four states here. Kansas, looking at the 10 year, was almost 54%, Minnesota 52, North Dakota 70 plus, and Wisconsin a shade above 42. So it's consistent across your 8 states. You mentioned trade and tariffs, and that to me, like beginning this journey, we've been doing this podcast since not quite 2 years yet, and it's been fascinating for me to talk to folks like you. But I'm also just by my nature a people watcher, and I'm fascinated by people. And for this industry, the psyche of the people who are part of this is mesmerizing to me. And I keep wondering how people process, because I've covered politics for 25 years. As Trump is proceeding through all of this tariff stuff, you've got threats and he backs off, and then it's not quite as high. Then there's this, there's that. You don't quite know what's going to stick, what's not. I can't fathom how people plan
Yeah.
because this has the potential to impact so many different things. How does that, as you're looking at all these numbers, how does that come into play as you're looking ahead, especially?
Yeah. Well, and let me put that even on a different timeline. For most agricultural producers, your opportunity to sell what it is you produce or you do happens once a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're really focused on a specific timeline, a specific horizon that you're betting your entire year's success on what's it going to be on that given day. Now,
Hmm.
that's not fully accurate. We know producers, harvest in the fall and they have an opportunity to sell that. But what all of that means is volatility is really, really significant. And we've seen volatility increase in agriculture, over that time frame. And so, certainly there are ways to manage that volatility, hedging, forward selling, your crops or livestock or whatever that is. But I think by and large, agriculture tends to stay out of some of that noise. We read headlines and we see that, we're gonna you pick the country, Mexico, we're gonna, stop buying Mexican
Tomatoes.
cattle. We're gonna,
Yeah.
impose a 40% tariff on all exports.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, I think most producers don't get caught up in what the headlines are. They focus on what they can control, raising a good crop, and then where I have an opportunity, I'll take advantage of some of the forward markets to sell that crop, where it makes sense, right? So we don't necessarily see our customers get really bogged down in headlines and all the different volatility. But certainly, it can influence your thought process, and that level of uncertainty around trade in the future or tariffs or whatever that is, bringing that back to what we're talking about today as real estate values probably serves to keep some people on the sidelines because of that uncertainty or that anticipated volatility where maybe they would be in the market.
Jumping in.
And I think the other side of that could be we've talked about reduced sales. There's things in, farm bills, tax bills that drive decisions on when people are maybe wanting to sell a farm
Farm
as
bill?
they
You
look
think?
at
Oh, you think
return.
Congress will actually do a farm bill? Do you have some news you want to drop here?
I do not have that insight, and we'll leave that to some other experts. But a farm bill would serve to bring some more stability,
Hmm.
and help some of that volatility. So I personally would love to see us have a farm bill that we all kind of knew what that was going to look like and what the future held.
As I'm glancing back over your report for Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and then North Dakota was kind of flat here. Do those four states have any kind of commonality why they're either flat or slightly below?
Um,
Or is it all kind of individual based
I,
on the state?
I think when you look at, those individual time frames, it's probably much more local than it is geographically dispersed.
Okay.
Real estate is a very local market. And especially as we've talked about, the buyers in this market are largely producers. And, so they're geographically bound to what that is. Another big influence is just what's the overall demand and what are the producers that are looking to expand during that time frame. So I don't know that I would draw a conclusion that the prices in Iowa are necessarily linked more closely to Minnesota or South Dakota. Um, as I said, largely real estate is a local market that we like to look at across a broad geography. Now, David, we think about some of those primary drivers of producer sentiment, what they think, how are they feeling
Hmm.
about things, supply and demand, once again, more of a local thing, and then interest rate environment as an influence. Those are more macro levels. So you have to kind of dissect them each individually when you look at it by state level.
How much are you putting into that if the Fed starts ticking this down maybe a little by little in the second half of the year? How much of an effect, if any, do you see that in value?
Yeah, I think, a reduction in interest rates is really the effect is it's a reduction in the overall cost. As we talk about real estate purchases, we talk about financing, it's a reduced, finance expense. It's their interest expense. Now I think something that is important to talk about is, we read all the headlines and there's the disagreement in DC whether rates should stay flat or
Hmm.
rates should come down. It's important to understand they're talking about short-term interest rates.
Yeah.
And just because short-term interest rates come down doesn't necessarily mean that the interest rate we're paying on our houses or on farmland loans is going to also come down. Um, the yield curve is still relatively flat, where normally it would be a forward sloping yield curve. So I personally think we will see short-term rates drift lower. I don't, I think the Federal Reserve is actually meeting today, and I think
Yeah.
that
As we
the
talk.
general
Yeah.
consensus is um, they'll hold interest rates steady, but signal probably a drop in September. Um, I don't know that that'll naturally translate into a reduction in interest rates, long-term interest rates, which is generally what we're talking about when we talk about real estate rates.
So, as you kind of reflect on what the first 6 months of trends show in this report, what are you then looking in for? What kind of forces are you looking for in the second half of 25? What's got your attention?
So if we look at, the real estate values through June, what were those largely influenced by? It was people's thoughts and beliefs about what happened the last part of 2024 and what was in front of them.
Hmm.
Most of the sales occur in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of the year. Most of these purchases were influenced at a time when corn and soybean prices were probably 50 cents to a dollar higher than they were today. Um, there was just a disaster bill that put $40 an acre against corn into their pocket. So I think the producer sentiment was better 3 and 4 months ago than what it is today. Today, there's more of a bias towards we're probably entering into a lower commodity price cycle.
Hmm.
It's going to be tougher to make money. And let me be clear, Dave, my crystal ball's not very clear,
Hmm.
but if I had to speculate, I would say we'll probably see more downward pressure on real estate values for that very reason. I think the overall producer sentiment and outlook is probably more um, bearish than bullish, just given the price environment we're seeing right now. So you're more likely to see people stay on the sidelines, hold on to the available cash that they have until they see maybe a little more certainty about, okay, what's this commodity price cycle going to look like? Um, but there'll still be an active market. But back to your question, I would anticipate more downward pressure on values than upward.
I wonder if we could wrap up like this. This is more anecdotal than empirical, but for the folks you talk to, and I appreciate that you already made the solid point about, if you're a producer, you can't be either up or down too much when you're seeing a potential tariff or reduced tariff. Maybe this is going to happen, maybe this is not.
Yeah.
But maybe just more anecdotally, as you talk to folks, do you get the sense that there's more optimism than that when this is all said and done, we will have expanded our trade partners, or that it's going to go the other way and this is going to be a tough way to go for a while and we're potentially lose some of these partners because of these increased tariffs? And I appreciate that gets us way off track from your survey, but just curious from the folks you engage with.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, Dave, there's more optimism than pessimism. And if we're completely honest with ourselves, agricultural producers have to be optimists because focusing on the windstorm that's on its way or the hailstorm or I've had not enough rain or too much rain, I think by and large agricultural producers are optimists. But as I hear people talk about the impact of trade, tariffs. I think the general sentiment is we're heading in the right direction. We're continuing to focus on ways to ensure that our access to food and crop markets is improved. And while there may be some short-term challenges, at the end of the day, there's not a significant glut of agricultural commodities that exists. And I think as we think about the last time we went through some of these trade disputes and tariffs, what we find is that agricultural commodities, we may not sell directly to China, but at the end of the day, China is consuming the same amount of corn as they did the year prior. There's not a great substitute product.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think tariffs have less of an impact on demand where there's not a great substitute product for that. And so those commodities or those may flow through a different channel, or they may be sold to a different thing. But at the end of the day, the demand for food and agriculture, or food and crops and protein, is generally the same. We may sell it through a different manner, but the crops are getting sold. The pork, the beef is getting sold. We're not seeing significant increases in stocks and supplies.
Sounds good. Tim, thank you very much. Appreciate you walking us through all of this. Very good to talk to you.
Yeah, glad to join you.
You can learn more about Tim Koch and our profile piece about him. Find it in the American Farmland Owner newsletter. It comes out every week, totally free. And if you like, you can go to the website, enter your email address, and have the newsletter sent right to your inbox. That's it. Simple as that. Check it out at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for your support. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please tell your friends, like and share this. Let them know what we're doing here. And thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.